Good evening, everyone. We're basically making an audible here. It's almost football season. The guy that was going to be in that chair, or he will be in that chair, is still circling the airport. And so we're going to take it from where we are. We appreciate all of your attendance. I'm Tom Fanning. I'm the chairman, CEO, and president of the Southern Company. I am also the deputy chair of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank, and I'll be the chairman of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank in January. So I think I can handle this kind of thing. Southern Company is the sponsor of this event, and it's really important to us. Southern Company is one of the largest electric utilities in America. From an energy production standpoint, we're just a wee bit smaller, but about the size of the nation of Australia. We operate in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and the Panhandle of Florida. And so much of what we do impacts the families we are privileged to serve. 4.5 million families in the Southeast. But what's interesting is 48% of the families we serve make less than $40,000 a year. And those families make tough kitchen table economic decisions every day. When you think about the impact of energy on those families, it is so important that we get it right. Clean, safe, reliable, affordable, and a balance. In my role at the Fed, I advise the Fed on what the real world ramifications of policy are manifesting themselves to be. Fortunately, the Southeast is one of the great growing areas organically in America. And I think, you know, when we think about clean, safe, reliable, affordable, being successful there really gives America an unassailable advantage to grow manufacturing jobs, grow personal incomes, and make American lives better. One of the other things I do that's relevant to this topic is I co-chair at the Business Roundtable the North American Energy Security Plan, along with Dave Cody of Honeywell. And I think we have an opportunity in all of our lives, in our parents' lives, where we can change the conversation about what America may be in terms of economic growth, in terms of employment, and everything else. And we can create, I think, an opportunity built out of abundance, not scarcity, that will serve us well for decades to come. It's a wonderful time to be in this business. Look forward to chatting with you as we go forward.
Great. I'm David Leonhardt with the New York Times. I'm a columnist of the Times, former Washington bureau chief. I run a new venture at the Times called The Upshot. And we'll have Jason Furman, who has been an advisor to presidential candidate Kerry, President Clinton, and now President Obama. Has run the Hamilton Project. We'll have him here. We think he's just about landed and now just has to get over here. And join the conversation shortly. But we wanted to start by talking about the subject that when Jason's here, we'll really get into more detail about, which is the state of the economy and jobs. And Tom and I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And the way I guess I would start off by framing the conversation is that it feels to me like we're now 15 years into a disappointing economy. That in the late 90s, we had this incredible boom, and it looked like we'd solved our economic problems. And the economy, in some ways, hasn't been healthy since then. And I think it should make anyone who thinks the answers are a simple set of political solutions to have some humility about that, because growth was slow under George W. Bush. It was on pace to be the slowest decade of economic growth since World War II. Then we had a crisis, which made it by far the slowest decade of growth. It has been slow under Barack Obama. It has been slower than the president and his advisors expected it to be. We just got another GDP report that was really disappointing. A lot of that was weather.
Negative 2.9.
But it's not as if the economy's strong. And so I guess what I wanted to sort of start out and ask you about, as someone who is in business, how worried are you about the long-term health of the economy from your perch at both the Fed and the company? And why is it that we've now had 15 years with disappointing economic performance?
Value is a function of risk and return. And when I think about kind of the objectives of the Fed right now, they're doing a lot of interventionist policies in order to encourage return. Now, what does return mean in this context? I think it means economic growth, GDP growth, But the risk element, I think, is what's often left out of capital markets and, frankly, this conversation about what level of intervention at the Fed is appropriate. And that is the notion of keeping interest rates artificially low, the idea of quantitative easing, and now we're tapering that. The relevant question, I think, for the Fed right now is the benefit of their intervention on the economy and growing more worth the risk of keeping artificially low interest rates and quantitative easing, that is, inflating the balance sheet of the United States government. It's a fascinating moment in history because when you look around the world, those of you that are into financial geekiness, if you've heard of the concept of beta, beta is a statistic that people use to measure the volatility of the market of a stock compared to the market. If you owned every stock in the market, your beta would be equal to 1. Now, Southern Company, I hope you're all stockholders. Southern Company has, I think, years 2 and 3 ago, the second lowest beta in the S&P 500. Last year, I think we were 7th in the S&P 500 in terms of low beta.
Low beta is good or high beta is good?
Well, it doesn't matter. It means low volatility compared to the market, okay? Here's my thing. When I look over the last 4 to 5 years of the worldwide economy, and especially the United States economy, the time series beta, what has happened to volatility around the world and in the United States economy? Not only is it slow, it is riskier. The volatility is higher. And so when I think about the fragility of the economy as we kind of get through this economic growth projection that people are thinking about, it's not just that we're slow. It's that we're more volatile. We are more subject to event risk than we ever have before. What's the ramifications to the United States economy about that? People like me that invest billions of dollars in CapEx. I think one of the most important issues is, and you see this in unemployment, and you see this in the capital measures, you see that CEOs are reluctant to commit to long-term capital. CEOs are reluctant to commit to adding to employment because there is so much volatility out there. What we've got to do is get to a sustainable economy that is regular, predictable, and sustainable.
One thing that I struggle with when people talk about the uncertainty out there, they often talk about regulatory uncertainty. You did not, but that's what they often talk about.
Well, that's big.
One thing that I don't understand is if you look at any of the data on how the economy is doing, on gross job creation, on new business formation, you don't notice the fact that we went from George W. Bush to Barack Obama. All these problems have existed under both of them. And given that they have such a different approach to regulation, it's left me somewhat skeptical that that is a main driver of this. Because if Obama's approach to regulation was the solution or the problem, it seems to me we would see much more of a disconnect in all these statistics, and we don't. Do you think that policy matters? Or do you think it's maybe secondary or tertiary and the forces that have been holding the economy back?
So policy absolutely matters. And I think overreaching regulation is gunk in the engines of commerce in America. I do. What we need is a sustainable regulatory environment that people can actually kind of rely on and predict and take action on. You know, this idea of comparing George W. Bush to Obama to me is a little bit of a red herring, because they're totally different economic situations. Mm-hmm. What we've got to do, and in fact anybody that buys stock, you don't buy stock on what happened in the past, you buy stock on what's going to happen in the future. And when we look around in the unease in Europe, driven by Vladimir, when we look about the unease in the Middle East and what happens to the oil complex, there's a lot of reasons why, from a geopolitical standpoint, the United States should take, and I think could take, actions that will create a lot more certainty and allow people like me and other CEOs in the United States to take a lot more firm action, a lot more decisive action, in growing this economy. One of the things I worry about, and I talk about it a lot, is the idea that people in government are trying to dumb down American aspiration. And I really believe, as an American, that we can do a lot better on an unacceptably high unemployment rate. I think we can do a lot better on GDP growth. And I think there are things we can do in government, and therefore, I think we can do things in business that will really give us the foundation to improve our lot for decades to come.
What do you think the most important things we could do?
So number one would be to remove the barriers. I'll just be parochial for a minute. Remove the barriers in the energy complex. See, I think we've set policy in America from the standpoint of shortages. We were worried about shortages in natural gas. We passed the National Fuel Use Act during the Carter administration. Worried about oil, and we have the National Oil Reserves and everything else. Look, through American innovation, we now are in a position where we can talk about energy complex not from shortages but from abundance. And my sense is by 2020, the United States, from an energy standpoint, can be energy secure. Now, that's not independent. We are still going to trade with people, even with people that don't have our best interests at heart. But we can be a net exporter. And by 2030, 2035, we can be the biggest energy producer in the world. We can displace the Middle East. What does that do to our lives? When I think about the price of energy, when I think about the worldwide economy, my sense, if we do the right stuff, then I think we can create this unassailable advantage to manufacturing and really create a renaissance of economic activity. I think different people have talked about what that might mean to the economy. Right now we talk about a 3% economy. 3% GDP growth is a great victory.
Right.
Now, after the first quarter reduction in GDP estimates annualized at 2.9%, now we say, oh, well, if we get 3% for the rest of the 3 quarters, second, third, fourth quarter, well, we can get 2.2% for the year, and that's a great victory. Baloney. We can do better. We're Americans. Think about the innovation that we did in IT. One time in my career, I was CIO. You guys know what CIO stands for, right? Chief Information Officer. Many days I thought that stood for career is over. Okay? The same kind of liberation in terms of regulation, in terms of opportunity, we can bring in the energy sector. The energy sector is fundamental to everything that touches American industry, and more important, the lives of the families we're privileged to serve. And I think we have a great opportunity. Get out of the way, make it a reality.
The thing that I guess makes me uncertain whether that will work so well is the decade of the aughts, right? We had a decade with a lot less regulation, and we didn't have a great economy, right? We had a great economy in the 80s under Reagan. We had a great economy in the 90s under Clinton. We've now had 15 years of a bad economy, and it just leaves me skeptical that sort of freeing the regulation, that regulation is the problem.
It's a very interesting point. It really is, and it's a very valid point. I would never dismiss the notion that the kind of question you're raising is true, but I will say this too. There were a lot of other policy objectives going on. For example, everybody should own a house, and we created a housing bubble.
Yes, we did.
We created a credit bubble. Do we have an interest rate bubble? I don't know. It's fascinating to see how these things will unwind. I think what's clear to me as a CEO of a major company in America is that if you let the market work, rather than over-regulate it. I understand that there's the pendulums and the natural reaction to the aughts may be over-regulation. If we can swing back and unleash American innovation, I think we can do great things for ourselves, our kids, and like I say, decades to come.
What do you think are the innovations that, the easy answer to this question would now be a driverless car, right? Maybe 2 years ago it would have been a more creative answer, but I don't have any good answers, any creative answers. What do you think are the innovations that we today aren't thinking about at all, and yet there's a decent chance that 10 years from now, they're going to be as ubiquitous as the little things in our pockets?
Yeah, so I don't have it with me. Oh, I do. I should have turned this thing off. This thing right here. So Southern Company is the only company in the electric utility space today that does proprietary, robust research and development. And we actually go through innovation exercises where we try and predict the future. And then we go back every 5 years and look, what were we right, what were we wrong? We predicted the multifunctional communication device. In fact, there actually is a company we run called Southern Link that does 4 functions. It does, it does telephone, and it does packet data, and it does push to talk, and it does all this stuff. But what we did not predict with this thing is the power of the apps and the multifunctional kind of webbing of this function, right? That's what we didn't predict. That's where I think we will not predict in the future. There's this fascinating thing in technology right now that sensors are becoming so cheap that any asset worth $100 or more will have a sensor on it, and we'll be able to manage it. Now think about that for a minute. All of a sudden, the idea of, well, okay, I come from energy, so it's smart generation, smart grids, smart meters, smart home. Anything you have that's worth $100 is going to have a sensor. And what's the app to that? How will we network those things together? And one of the theories I have is that so long as you and I have to intervene on those assets, it'll never take off. But, now this sounds a little bit like just crazy stuff. But because of sensors, if those assets become adaptive, and if they learn about your kind of behavior and your kind of way of life, they can create a whole new set of products and change entirely this whole definition of energy efficiency and lifestyle efficiency. I think we're heading into potentially, because of the innovation of IT and energy, a golden period in the economy of America. Things that we don't even think about right now, where you won't even have to intervene.
So part of that optimistic view is obviously the abundance of energy that you mentioned before,
right,
which
right.
5 years ago may have seemed like crazy optimistic talk, but thanks to the rise of fracking and other things, it sounds less crazy. The thing that it seems to me that hovers in the background of all of it is climate change, right? I think a lot of people are deeply worried about it. It has proceeded faster than scientists thought, not slower. How does Southern think about climate change, both in terms of your business and also in terms of the state of the country?
So you've given me the opportunity to give my commercial. So excuse me, but people can do this. Southern Company has done more for the climate in terms of carbon controls and a variety of things than any other company on the planet. I mentioned how big we are. We're in the Southeast. You may know that Southern Company is one of 2 companies in America pursuing the renaissance of nuclear in America. If you believe that carbon is an important issue in your future, nuclear is therefore a dominant solution. We must restart nuclear in America. Secondly, 21st century coal. Now I know there's a lot of naysayers out there about there's no such thing as clean coal. You're wrong. Coal is an important energy resource. It is in our national interest to figure out a way to use coal in a responsible way. Southern Company, by virtue of our research and development, has developed a technology where coal has a carbon footprint less than natural gas. We're deploying it in Mississippi today at a big scale. We've already made a big shift. We used to be a coal company. 70% of our energy came from coal. Now it's 35. 16% of our energy came from gas. Now it's 45. Southern Company is depending on what day and how you measure it, the 2nd or 3rd largest consumer of natural gas in America. Natural gas is a wonderful thing. The technology revolution of fracking has permitted that. But let me tell you, sports fans, it is not a panacea. There are 5 reasons why we need to be very cautious about natural gas for the future of America. I'll hit them really quickly. If you go on the websites or if you go and Google it, you can see the depth. But one is we haven't understood yet the environmental implications of fracking. Number 2, we haven't built out the infrastructure necessary to take advantage completely of these new natural gas finds. And that includes pipelines, it includes firm transportation within those pipelines, it includes storage. Number 3, it includes the notion of how the United States should export natural gas. I'm the 2nd or 3rd largest consumer. I am 100% in favor of unfettered exporting of natural gas. That sounds crazy, but I think it's the right position. Number 4, there is an enormous demand curve shift in the United States today about natural gas. The demand curve shift really centers on manufacturing using more natural gas in its process. It involves using more natural gas in transportation. It involves using more natural gas in energy production. When I think about the data underlying natural gas consumption in America, in 2012, the United States consumed about 67 BCF, billions of cubic feet per day on the average. In 2013, it was 70. A lot of experts predict that we could be at 100 BCF per day by 2020. Now, what happens to price and volatility in that environment? The last thing, 5th item. If you're going to have that much consumption of natural gas, how do you hedge it? How do you make it a manageable risk element? And that's the 5th element. It's a big issue. So that's one of the big issues that we face, and I think we can get through these things, but I can tell you it's a big deal. Let me finish off the other 2. I see we got an important guest here, but I got the floor. Renewables. I love renewables. I especially love photovoltaics. I think air is not the big issue in the future. I think it's water. We got to be concerned with both, but I think water is the big issue. I think photovoltaics will continue to play an important role. I think it's exciting. I think it's an enormous economic development. But there again, it's not a panacea. When people say we're going to do it all with renewables and energy efficiency, they're wrong. We're going to need a 50-year transition into a new energy portfolio for the United States. And the last thing is energy efficiency. We should all be good stewards of our environment. But when I think about those families that we serve, they want a better life, better place to live, better food to eat, better medical care, better education. Being good stewards, being more efficient, takes the unit price down. As people's standard of living increases, they will consume more energy. Don't apologize for that. That's good for America. Let's do it in a smart way.
I think we have someone else here to join us.
Yes, indeed.
Jason Furman, welcome.
Thank you.
How you doing? Good to see you.
Thank you. And I have to apologize for 2 things.
Yes.
1, for being late. And 2, you told me you wanted to have a broad discussion of American economic policy. And all I want to discuss is one particular sector of the economy, which is the airline industry.
Yes.
So, but once we get off that topic, maybe we could try to get some ability to focus on some of the other sectors.
You're in favor of re-regulation as part of the larger socialist economic plan?
I probably shouldn't be commenting.
Okay, you opened it up. Thank you for joining us, Jason. So I introduced you without you being here.
Great.
And then we solved all of the economy's problems.
Okay.
So, as I said before, Jason has a long history working in economic policy. There aren't too many people who have, in fact, the depth of your history over the last 20 years, having been Kerry's chief economic advisor in the campaign, having been Obama's, having worked with President Clinton, having run the Hamilton Project, having taught at NYU, many other things. You've worked in a lot of different parts of administrations as well. We started off by talking about what I think of as this 15-year economic slump, and I didn't invent that notion, which is that since the 90s, it's sort of felt like the economy's never been fully strong. We had weak growth, we had a crisis, we've had a slow recovery. Why is that? And why should we have any optimism that it's going to get better?
I might have said in some ways it's the exact opposite.
Okay.
The most important ingredient in the economy is productivity. And the most important type of productivity is what economists call total factor productivity growth, or multi-factor productivity growth, and that's the amount of output you get from a given amount of capital and a given amount of labor. If you look in broad strokes, we had very rapid productivity growth in the decades after World War II, unusually rapid for a country that was at the leading edge of technology. If you're catching up like China is today, for example, it's easier to grow faster. But when you have to invent everything from scratch, push the envelope further, it's harder. We had the advantage in the 50s and 60s that there was a lot of innovation that went into World War II, for example, military innovation that we then commercialized and used for the civilian economy in the decades afterwards. We also made major investments like the interstate highway system. All of that ground to a halt in the early 70s, and the oil shocks caused a disruption in the economy. They coincided with the petering out of some of that innovation and inventiveness, and for about 20 years we had very slow total factor productivity growth. Starting again in the mid-90s, you had growth pick up again, and pick up to be twice what it was in the 70s and 80s, not as fast as it was in the 50s and 60s. There's some debate over whether that growth has continued or slowed down. It's hard to measure these numbers from years to year. It's easier to measure them over 10, 20, 30-year periods of time. But the combination of information technology, the way it's manifested itself in broadband, mobile computing, cloud computing, a whole bunch of aspects of our economy really do seem to have sped up. That gives you the supply side of the economy and the total amount you can make. You're not always at the frontier of what you can produce as an economy, and in 2008 and 2009, for example, we fell really badly short of that frontier. We're still short of that frontier. We haven't caught up to it yet. So we've run into a set of macroeconomic problems of insufficient aggregate demand. But I think in terms of the overall potential for the economy, if anything, it's gotten better in the last 20 years.
What's your sense on the relationship between productivity and unemployment?
In the long run, I don't think there's any relationship between them. No matter what machines you have or don't have, at most points in time, 95% of the people who want to work can work, plus or minus a few percent. Over shorter periods of time, if productivity growth unexpectedly speeds up, I think that means businesses can afford to hire more people. It'll drive the natural rate of unemployment down. I think we got an unemployment rate down to 4% in the late 90s because we had a spurt of productivity growth. I think the converse is also true. When productivity slows for a period of 5-10 years, you'll probably have a higher unemployment rate.
To come back to your answer, it seems to me that's a really important distinction. You think, and I guess the president thinks, that the main problem here is that we had this big crisis, terrible crisis, worse since the Depression, and we essentially still have a shortfall in demand, rather than that we have some sort of, as Larry Summers might say, secular stagnation, that we have some sort of long-term problem that helps explain why median household income is lower than it was in 1999, that helps explain why the share of adults working isn't rising. You think it's mostly the crisis rather than something that stretches back further.
I think the thing that stretches back further is inequality and the typical family not seeing its income growth connected to overall growth. So I think we have a deep structural, decades-long challenge in the economy, but I don't think it's so much in the aggregate overall economy. There, I think we had obviously a massive problem with the Great Recession, but that doesn't feel to me like a deeper endemic decades-long feature of the American economy. It feels like a massive bump that we hit that we'll get out of. The problem is when we get out of it, will we get out of the thing that wasn't just a massive bump but has been there much longer, which is that inequality.
You know what we're seeing in the Southeast is this, that we're seeing tremendous growth in the manufacturing economy. In fact, we're seeing really attractive numbers. The renaissance is happening. But because of increased productivity and technology and a variety of other things, the growth in jobs in that economy is way low. The other effect that we're seeing is, so therefore the growth in jobs is not in manufacturing, it's in the service industries, and therefore personal incomes are down. Further, we're seeing for a variety of factors, not full-time employment, but part-time employment coming to fore, which is reducing household incomes. One of the arguments I make on the Fed, when the Fed has these dual objectives of unemployment plus inflation, the unemployment number is way overwrought. And in fact, I would argue the more important number is household income growth. What's your sense of that?
I mean, I don't comment on what the Federal Reserve does, but you know, I think unemployment, the Council of Economic Advisors, which I chair, was established in 1946 by the Full Employment Act of 1946, and we'd come through this wrenching Great Depression. People had discovered that unemployment doesn't automatically solve itself, that it requires, at some points in time, some action to solve it. And Congress wanted to do something to enshrine that understanding in law and institutionalize it. And they did two things. They set up a mandate for the Fed, that it would have a dual mandate of employment and price stability. And then, probably somewhat less importantly, they created the Council of Economic Advisors and asked us to write a report once a year. Employment makes a lot of sense. Right now, the unemployment rate is 6.3%. That's getting back to where you think it ultimately can get. But people working part-time for economic reasons are unusually high. The participation rate has fallen. A lot of that's for demographic reasons. I think more of it's for demographic reasons than people appreciate, but part of it is due to the business cycle, and we'd like to wring that out of the system. And until you get back to full employment, you have this free lunch staring us in the face. That's what Keynes taught you. You have a bunch of empty factories. You have a bunch of people who want jobs. There's not enough ability for them to buy things from the factories. You do something to jumpstart it. You put them in the factories. They make stuff. They earn money. They're able to buy things. And instead of the economy operating below its potential, you have an economy operating at its potential. How to expand that potential, increasing productivity, is much harder. How to connect people to that potential inequality, much harder. But the simplest thing we can do is make sure we're using all the potential we already have.
But we're way below potential, right? And as a result, inflation pressures are really below what we thought we would get with all the levers and buttons we've been pushing and pulling.
Correct. I don't think inflation pressures are a particularly serious problem in the economy right now. I mean, in terms of the two things we worry about, inflation and employment, one of them is still not all the way there. The other one is well anchored and well under control.
The employment issue you mentioned is a little bit technical, but it's really important. It's important for the Fed in a way that I understand you're not going to talk about. But it's important for all kinds of policymaking, which is our unemployment rate has basically done this, right, from the audience's perspective. It's fallen. A percentage of adults working basically in the crisis did this, and since then has done, working has done this, right? There's almost no recovery in the percentage of adults who are employed in this country. You alluded to that a little bit. Mm-hmm. If you simply look at, well, how much of that is because we have more people who are 70 years old than we used to because of the aging of the baby boomers, you see it has some little effect on that. But you seem to think there are other things going on than just that. Can you talk about that? Because that affects every decision that an economic policymaker makes. And even if you don't want to talk about it, it has an enormous impact on how quickly the Fed undoes their emergency measures.
Yeah. If you look, the labor force participation rate, that's the number of people who are either working or they're actively looking for a job, has fallen by 3 percentage points since the beginning of the recession to now. And it's continued to fall even as the economy recovered. A lot of this is because two really big things happened at once. Both of them happened in 2008. One was a massive recession, and that tends to lower the participation rate. The other is the people who were born in 1946 turned 62 in 2008. They became eligible for Social Security benefits. And so that first wave of baby boomers, some of them, not all of them, started to retire. Those two things hit at once, and they both lowered our participation rate. As we recover, that first factor, the business cycle, is going to be moving in the other direction. It's going to be bringing people back into the labor market. But at the same time, that second factor, the aging, is going to continue to pull people out. And those two forces are going to be fighting with each other, and they're going to be roughly equal. Want to layer on top of the two of those, though, there was a lot going on even before 2008 that should actually concern us about people's participation in the labor force. If you look at prime age men, that's men between 25 and 54, their labor force participation rate has been falling since the 1950s, continuously for 60 years. If you look at women, there was a large influx of women into the workforce starting in the early 70s, going through 1999. Starting into 1999, women's labor force participation flattened and started to fall. So you had the recession, you had the aging of the population, and the two of them layered themselves on top of these trends that we already had. I think that presents a really important challenge for economic policy. I said before, figuring out how to have more technology, expand our potential, is one of the trickier questions in economic policy. The single easiest thing you can do, though, is get more people working, get more people into the labor force. And there's a lot of ingredients for that. People who, as they age, want to continue to work, what we can do to enable that. And I think the Affordable Care Act in some ways provides an incentive in one direction, in some ways provides help in the other. I think women's labor force participation is a really underappreciated issue in our economy, and we've grown too complacent about it. 20 years ago, we were higher than Europe, way higher than Japan. They've increased for 25 straight years. We've basically flattened out, and now most European countries have more women participating in the workforce than we do. Within a couple of years, at the rate it's going, Japan will have a higher fraction of its women participating in its workforce than we do. You ask why that is. The fact that we are one of the countries in the world that doesn't have paid leave, and the other country is Papua New Guinea. The United States, Papua New Guinea, the only two countries that don't have paid leave. I think that's part of it. The state of childcare in this country and a range of other things that we could do, not just recovering from the recession, but as we move beyond that to get more people into the workforce.
Let's talk about one bit of economic good news, which I realize tends to be in short supply these days. Health costs. The slowdown in health costs is pretty remarkable. That is a big deal in all kinds of ways, right? You don't have a secret pile of money to pay your employees' health benefits. It's the same pile of money that contributes to CapEx and profits and employees' wages. If our health care costs continued to slow, which is probably too optimistic, a lot of the fears about the deficit that we've spent years having will prove to have been overwrought. The slowdown seems to have started before Obamacare. Doesn't seem to stem directly from Obamacare, in my reading of the evidence. You may disagree. But it also seems that Obamacare has put in place some things that have played a role in the slowdown. What do you think is causing it, and what's your forecast for how it's going to continue? Or to phrase that another way, do we really have a scary long-term deficit, or is that a lot less scary than it used to be?
Mm-hmm. I think some of the energy issues you were discussing before I got here are the biggest, most appreciated trend in the economy. I think people really do get and understand
the domestic energy boom.
The domestic energy boom. I think the slowdown in health costs is the biggest unappreciated story in the US economy. If you look adjusted for inflation, per capita health spending in the last couple of years is growing at the slowest rate since 1960. When I say the slowest rate since 1960, that's when we began collecting the data. So for all we know, it was the slowest rate since even earlier than that, and we don't have the numbers. Medicare this past year is going to be flat in nominal dollars. Not growing with inflation, not growing with population, not growing with beneficiaries, not growing with health system, flat in nominal dollars, which represents a large decline. This has profound implications for the federal budget. The Congressional Budget Office is conservative about how it incorporates news. They don't see just one piece of good news and change their picture. They've marked down health spending over the next decade by over $1 trillion. Their measure of the long-run budget deficit, something called a fiscal gap, used to be over 5% of GDP. Now it's less than 2% of GDP. That's the adjustment we'd need to make to stabilize the debt for 75 years. So there's still an adjustment, but it's a lot smaller than we used to think. It'll help employment growth. It'll help solve some of those inequality problems and connect people's employment to wage increases, because less of it is eaten up by health. Do we know if it'll last? Probably won't all last, but we've had a big enough change that if even 1/3 of the slowdown in health we've seen in the last couple of years lasts, that would add over $1,000 to the typical family's income after a decade. So, some of this is luck, some of this is the recession, some of this started in 2007, but a bunch of it was the Affordable Care Act helping to build on all of those trends. And a lot of the most exciting things in the Affordable Care Act, a lot of the innovation that'll help bring bundled payments, accountable care, all of those types of changes are ones that we're only seeing the beginning of today.
There's another issue, though. It's the flip side of that argument, is that the Affordable Care Act provided a lot of uncertainty for a lot of people. And they went uninsured, or they had higher copays than they had before, and therefore healthcare spending contributed to the negative 2.9% revision in the first quarter GDP numbers.
I think what contributed to uncertainty was the health system we had before the Affordable Care Act. I think 50 million people without insurance is a massive amount of uncertainty. I think people in an individual market where they develop asthma or have a cough and get thrown out of their insurance plan was massive uncertainty. People who couldn't move from job to job because they might lose their health insurance, so they were locked into a job, was massive uncertainty. The uncertainty was what we had before. We've shifted to a new system which gives families considerably more certainty than they've ever had in health insurance in this country. Talking about 1/4 of health data also borders on absurd. You look at the quarterly health numbers, and they bounce up and down. And they've always bounced up and down. In fact, in the last year, they've bounced up and down with about as much volatility as they did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. A bunch of that is the statisticians have a hard time measuring the data on a quarterly frequency. They were up a little bit more in Q4. They were down a little bit. A bunch of people, when the original estimate said they were up in Q1, they wrote articles saying that showed the Affordable Care Act failed. Now it's down, that shows it failed. Keep your eye on the ball, look at a 1-year trend, 3-year trend, 5-year trend. Quarterly data doesn't make any sense in this regard.
Couldn't agree more. My only point is, don't put a rosy picture on it. Let's say we don't know what the effects are to date, and as time goes on, then I think we'll see where reality really is here.
Correct. I don't want to put an overly rosy picture on it, but you look back at the people who said we wouldn't enroll people, and you see over 7 million enrolled. Premiums came in 15% below what the Affordable Care Act said they would, what the Congressional Budget Office said they would come in at. You have a decent risk pool in terms of young people. You haven't seen death spirals. You see the uninsured rate coming down. At some point in time, and Paul Krugman wrote this today, but we've all been giving the speech for a while. People have to admit that it's working.
I like to sometimes think of issues as we know where they're headed or we don't know where they're headed. I think I put abortion in the category of, at the 50th Aspen Ideas Festival, there will still be really healthy debates about abortion, and I would guess it won't be very different from where we are now. Same-sex marriage, I think, will be where we are on interracial marriage and the fact that the newspaper I work for runs Jewish bylines on the front page, something it didn't used to do. I think it'll look crazy that there used to be a debate about this. Where do you put adoption of the Affordable Care Act by states? I would argue it goes in the inevitable category. I would argue that because it takes only one governor at one time with one legislature to adopt it, and that essentially no state will ever go back, to use my frame, at the 50th Aspen Ideas Festival, we will have something close to 50 states with full adoption. Do you agree with that, or are you more uncertain?
I don't think we'll have to wait that long.
Okay. The 20th Aspen Ideas Festival.
I'm not going to put a number on it, but the logic is so overwhelmingly clear. When the federal government picks up 90% of the cost, you pick up 10% of the cost, and you get a whole lot of benefits that you leverage up with that. There's almost no federal state program that has a match like that. Medicaid, which was taken up by 50 states, was basically a 50-50 match. The federal government did 50%. When it was originally created, the federal government did 50%. States did 50, and all of them took that up. Unemployment insurance was basically 50-50 when that was created. all the states took that up. There's an unfortunate ideological debate going on that's overriding this one, and that's led some states to not make rational decisions. A lot of those states, the governors would like to do it, and they're stuck. But at some point, this will become less politicized in those states, and the logic will be clearer.
But ideology is really serious, right? Meaning there are people in Aspen who vote for higher taxes on themselves. There are people in Kansas, famously, who vote for the party that is not trying to help them on economics. Couldn't we have a situation where there's just a fundamentally long-term disagreement about how involved the federal government could be? Or you think the money talks and brings people in?
I mean, I've had hard enough time predicting what GDP will be in the second quarter, and we're most of the way through the second quarter today, predicting political systems of states in decades to come. But to me, it seems like the logic is incredibly clear. And you have all these models. You have welfare, TANF, unemployment insurance, Medicaid itself. All of these are federal, state. All of these are voluntary choices by states. All of them are ideologically controversial. All of them have a less generous federal role. And all of them have 100% take up by the states. Now, more or less generous, unemployment insurance and Medicaid aren't as generous in Mississippi as they are in California or New York State. But you have 100% of them taking up those programs, and I think this one will go the same way.
As a CEO, do you think of the Affordable Care Act as here to stay? Now?
Oh, sure. I don't get involved in the politics of it, the reality of it. I think the idea, what's the alternative? Is it repeal? I find that extraordinarily hard to conceive of. My view is any important program like this that deals with the welfare of the citizens of the United States, I think it's going to require some kind of modification over time. I don't think we've got it right now. And I think it's going to require some modification to make sure that the burden placed on the taxes of the United States government and the benefits accorded to its citizens are in proportion. That's what I think we're going to have to kind of deal with over time.
Something absolutely you want to improve on. You don't get anything right the first time you do it. You learn from experience. There are certainly things I observe today that I wish we had thought more about when we weren't sleeping in 2009 and 2010, and would love to send them over to Congress and make the Affordable Care Act even better. They haven't been exactly begging for that, but hopefully one day they will. And we'll be ready with the list.
Speaking of the lack of legislation, how does the president think about his remaining 2+ years in office in terms of what he wants to get done in your area? It seems hard to believe that any significant legislation will pass Congress, no matter how many times he and John Boehner play golf, or no matter how many times he has dinner with senators, or no matter who the new majority leader is, or it just seems like it's not going to happen. And so given that, and given that he still has, it seems, a lot of days of being president, what realistically will he focus on in the broad area that you advise him on?
He's not giving up and just relaxing. He wants to get as much done as he can in that 2.5 years, and he's aware that he has 2.5 years. He's aware that you can do a lot in it, and also aware about how quickly that time can pass. Some of that is we're trying to do everything we can with our executive authority. We saw that most recently in climate change, and maybe you discussed that before we came, and happy to talk more about it. You see that in things that we can do with our unique authority like that, or an area like overtime is an economically significant regulation. There's other things you can do with mobilization. There's a big long-term unemployed problem right now. Part of it is companies often inadvertently screen people out, 2 identical people. One has been unemployed 9 months, one 3 months. Don't throw out the resume of the 9-month person. We brought a lot of Fortune 100 businesses and others to the White House in January or February, and got them all to sign a code of conduct for best practices and how to remedy that problem and do a better job hiring long-term unemployed. Federal government had some problems with the way we were screening and doing our hiring, and we changed that practice too. You look at something like the minimum wage. if Congress passed it, 28 million people would get a raise. They haven't, but Maryland, Connecticut, Hawaii, and several other states have. The Gap, IKEA, and others have raised their wages. Cities have raised their wages, and a lot of them directly credit the push that the president has made around it. On legislation, though, if you look at some of the big items on the president's agenda, we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world, lowering that while broadening the base, because we have some of the most loopholes of any country in the world, reforming our housing finance system to wind down Fannie and Freddie and replace them with something more sustainable, investing in America's infrastructure, and more important than those three combined, reforming our broken immigration system, which is, I think, the #1 thing we could do as a country economically and substantively. All four of those are completely bipartisan ideas with strong support on both sides. All of them, I think, are common sense economic policy. That's not enough to say all four of them will pass in, say, the next week or two. But it's more than enough motivation to keep at it and keep trying and see what you can do to push those and many other issues that I didn't list in that list forward.
Ari Fleischer, the former advisor to the second President Bush, has said that he can see, and he's in favor of immigration reform, he's said that he can see a path for it in the second 2 years of the second term. Basically, the idea being Republicans don't need to pass immigration reform to keep the House and possibly win the Senate. But there are a substantial number of Republicans like him who think they do need to do something like that to win the presidency again. And so once the political season shifts, the politics of that bill could shift. Do you all put serious stock in the idea that immigration could pass? Or does it feel like all the other things that sure, there's some way it might pass, but like gun control, like fixing Obamacare, like all these things, in the end, it's overwhelmingly unlikely to happen?
Right. I mean, I'm not a political genius, but I'm surrounded by them. And what strikes me about the political geniuses is that Congress and what it's going to do is generally beyond their comprehension and ability to predict. I remember, Rahm Emanuel is about as good at understanding Congress as anyone. And he used to be, my office in the White House used to be right upstairs from him. And he called us the Aspen Institute, which was, I don't think it was a term of high respect coming from him.
It was a brotherly rival thing.
Larry Summers retaliated by labeling him and the hallway that his office was on Tammany Hall, which I think he took as a compliment. But I remember one thing was, the famous one is the Affordable Care Act, which he thought wouldn't pass. Another thing was teacher jobs. We had passed teacher jobs as part of the Recovery Act. If you look at one thing that's made this business cycle more challenged compared to previous ones, I think the #1 thing is state and local governments have cut back really sharply, as opposed to previous business cycles where they leaned against them and helped get you out of it and stayed steady. We wanted to do another round of teacher jobs. Rahm said there was absolutely no chance it would ever pass, impossible, never, ever, 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 ever. So we sort of did it as a lark. Then they decided it's not going to pass, but they'll bring it to the floor of the Senate just to prove whose fault it was that it wasn't going to pass. They brought it to the floor of the Senate, and it passed. The House had already gone off for August break. Nancy Pelosi flew everyone back because it matters a lot for teacher funding, whether you sign it into law August 1st or wait till September. She flew the whole House back. She passed it. We signed it into law and helped prevent an awful lot of teachers from getting laid off that next year. That's something a really great political mind didn't see coming. Last year, a lot of great political minds thought there was nothing we'd ever do about the sequester. We were completely stuck with it. Turned out Paul Ryan didn't really like the defense cuts in the sequester. That motivated him to get together with Patty Murray, who told him there's no way you're getting rid of the defense cuts unless for every $1 you buy out of defense, you buy out $1 of non-defense. And don't worry, I'm willing to pay for all of it. So we'll cut the deficit over the medium and long run at the same time that we're investing more in education infrastructure. That was the type of logical no-brainer that, like a lot of logical no-brainers, somehow people figure out how not to do until they figured out how to do it. And they passed that in December. We bought out 60% of the sequester, and we have less severe cuts in education and infrastructure than we otherwise would have. We certainly don't have enough investment in education and infrastructure, but we had something a lot of people didn't predict. So I try to be there with the plans, there with the ideas, there with the ways to bring things together, solve the problems, figure out something that works, and you never know, when they'll come around or when they won't.
You worked for both President Clinton and President Obama. Philosophically, where would you compare their places on a spectrum? Do you think they're roughly in the same place and they've governed at different times? Or do you think the widespread notion that President Clinton is somewhat to the right of President Obama is accurate?
I think they're both pragmatic. They're both unorthodox enough that to the degree you see systematic differences, it's because we're in a time where the economy still isn't performing at its full potential and where we're several decades into this inequality trend and this middle class stagnation. Some of that was going on in the 1990s. Some of that we didn't realize was going on because we were looking at the wrong data. But it was much less severe, and it was masked by an economy where growth was higher and the unemployment rate was lower.
I guess, and they both angered their liberal base, right?
They both did what they thought was in the best interest of the country.
You mentioned climate. It seems a great opportunity to talk about it. What is, without going too much into the details, which I know are important, but are also highly technical, what is the most important thing for people to know about what you all just did on the climate? And what's your biggest worry about it?
The most important thing to know is that it is very ambitious and it's very flexible. We are asking power plants, I'm sorry, we're not asking power plants, we're asking states to lower their emissions. We're giving them flexibility in terms of the time path they take, in terms of when they hit that. We're giving them complete flexibility in terms of how they hit that. But we're certainly encouraging them to themselves do it in the most flexible manner possible. And in particular, and you could speak a lot more articulately to this than I could, a coal-fired power plant can, a lot of them could run even more efficiently. You can shift from coal to natural gas. You can shift from fossil fuels to power sources that don't emit any carbon, to renewables, and you can reduce the amount of power you use. These are the four general tools that we have based on our estimate as to what states could feasibly and reasonably do. They're assigned a target. They can then figure out how to hit it. One of the great ways they could choose to hit it is with cap and trade systems. Even better, they could choose to hit it with regional consortiums and cap and trade systems. And what that says is that whoever figures out the cheapest, most effective way to reduce carbon, they'll do it. Whoever is stuck in a way that's really expensive to reduce carbon, they won't have to. But they'll, de facto have a price put on their carbon that makes sure it's done in the most economically efficient way. That's one way states could do it. State could choose to do it another way, but all of them will have to do it, and they'll have to do it in a way that's ambitious but a flexible timetable.
And your biggest concern?
Obviously, it's not as perfect as we'd been able to do if we were able to design the law from scratch. We tried to design a law from scratch. It passed the House and got stuck in the Senate in 2009 and 2010. This gets at where most of the emissions, or about half of the emissions are, which is the power sector, a lot of that coming from coal, so it gets at that. We've gotten at transportation through fuel economy standards that we've put forward, but the economic ideal is that you're dealing in an integrated basis with the entire energy economy, not just large swaths of it at a time.
In your view of it?
That's a long answer.
What's the short one?
The short answer is there's nobody doing more about these issues than Southern Company. We're investing, when people, no, it's serious.
Then
when
no
people
one will benefit more. But sorry.
Listen, we represent, as CEO of the Southern Company, I represent families in the Southeast, 48% of which make less than $40,000 a year. I must take a balanced perspective in terms of clean, safe reliable, and affordable energy for those families. And when you think about dominant solutions for the United States economy, I think ideas like cap and trade are bad ideas that will tax what otherwise could provide the United States economy a way to grow. And frankly, I think Americans and politicians are thirsting for a way to play offense and thirsting for a way to play forward. And I think putting further sticks, more taxation, more burdens on the economy is not the right way to go. The argument is not about the objective. The argument, I think, will go to what do we do about it? And you know, Southern Company, building new nuclear, building coal that's cleaner than natural gas, switching from coal to gas, 26% carbon reductions in 5 years, more renewables, the largest voluntary solar state in the United States, energy efficiency. We're doing everything. We're doing it. Now, what's the right way for the United States to do it from a public policy standpoint is a very involved question.
Can I pursue that a little bit? Because I think that's terrific, everything. I mean, I don't know every detail of everything Southern Company is doing, but the way you described it sounded terrific. I guess one very simple question, do you think carbon emissions have some cost to society?
So there's no question that carbon is an important issue. As CEO of a company like Southern Company, I tend to let other people get engaged in the rhetoric. I'm involved in the solutions. We're the only company in America that does research and development. Let me tell you, we run the nation's only carbon capture research center. We run it for the Department of Energy. There is one in America, we run it. We're the only people that do carbon capture on a pre-combustion basis and post-combustion basis in terms of power generation. I would rather focus on the solutions, not the rhetoric.
Right. I was trying to break this down and actually get away from the rhetoric and get to the solutions. So as an economist, there's a notion called externalities. And that's, you take into account when you do your business the cost of paying your workers, the cost of buying the natural gas, the cost of running the lines. And then you take into account all the benefits you get in terms of people paying you, and you weigh those against you. You know all of that much better than I do. Economists have a notion called externalities, which is if there's some cost that doesn't show up on your ledger, but it shows up on society's ledger in an important way. And economists worry that most businesses aren't good-hearted enough to do something about those externalities. In fact, most economists would go even further than that and say most businesses shouldn't be good-hearted enough to do something about that. You have a responsibility to your shareholders, to your customers. So the question I have is, you're spending a lot of money, which is terrific, taking carbon dioxide, which is, other than its impact on climate change, a sort of harmless gas. 30 years ago, we wouldn't have worried at all about it, and trapping it and burying it at the bottom of a mine or the bottom of the ocean or wherever you're going to do it. You're presumably doing that because I guess I'm curious why you're doing that. And if you thought we were never going to regulate, we were never going to put a price on carbon, you were never going to have to face that, why would you be collecting all that gas and burying it at the bottom of the ocean? I mean, how would people and companies have the motivation to do this, to internalize this externality?
Well, let me first kind of change your example, because the plant that we're deploying in Mississippi is technology we developed along with Kellogg Brown Root. It will capture carbon, and we will use it in a process called enhanced oil recovery. We will actually produce a co-benefit. It's not a waste stream. We don't produce it. We don't stick it in the bottom of the ocean. We produce 2 million more barrels of domestic oil every year with that process. That is a win-win for America. With the energy that we produce out of that, and I've got to give you an index. I'm going to sound a little bit like a geek here, but if the carbon dioxide is indexed against the price of oil, and let's assume that price of oil is about $100 a barrel, the energy price coming out of that project in Mississippi will be about $1.25 per million BTU. Natural gas is about $4.80 per million BTU. So it's going to produce more efficient energy It will produce more domestic oil. It will use a resource in America that we cannot turn our backs on. We must find a way forward for coal in America. We own 27% of the world's coal reserves here in the United States. The benefits of the United States becoming energy secure are so overwhelming. Energy security breeds national security, breeds economic security. The effect of growing the economy and creating more jobs and growing personal incomes, these are the things that we must place a priority on. When I think about the policy of carbon and the policy of energy and the policy of the economy, the word I love for people to use is balance. And what I want to do is to create a balance in those policies where we grow the whole pie.
Right. I think I agreed with everything you just said. In terms of, I think I agreed with everything you just said, but again, it's just a simple question. Do you do more carbon capture and storage because there are regulations or you think there would be? And now that we're going to have these regulations, will you do even more carbon capture and storage? And why should we think you'll do the right amount of it, or any company would, absent some regulation? Because there is this other thing, other than the benefits of carbon dioxide for extracting oil, there's also the harm it does to the atmosphere. There's no reason you should take that into account unless policy tells you to.
Not true. We take it into account anyway. Look, Southern Company is based on the notion that we serve customers first. And in fact, we define our relationship with customers by providing the best reliability at the lowest prices with the best service available. And that has been our premise forever. It is the essence of our business model. The fact that we got to be a citizen whenever we serve. The fact that the communities have to be better off because we're there. It is clear to us that carbon is an important issue. It is clear to us that this administration is moving the United States into a carbon-constrained future. Therefore, what we do without a regulation, without a rule, without a law, is to take into account, now I'm going to get a little geeky again, but when we plan the future of generation for the Southeast, we take a full portfolio view. When President Obama talks about all the above, he must be talking about Southern Company.
Absolutely.
And when we view the probabilistic range of what outcomes may be, we look at high, low, medium gas prices, high, low, medium coal prices, we look at carbon prices.
Right.
So we do take into, hang on,
okay.
So we do take into account the potential cost of externalities as we develop optimal portfolios. We develop dominant solutions. That is why, taking into account those externalities, we're building new nuclear and a coal plant, 21st century coal, that's cleaner than natural gas.
I understand that all power companies assume a price of carbon in the future, and that's part of why they do the things they do. And I think that's terrific. That means you're only doing the things you do because you expect regulations or you expect something to happen in the future. Absent those, you would have a very different model for that portfolio and diversity you're talking about. You'd be doing a lot less for carbon. I'm not blaming you for doing a lot less for carbon. I'm just asking you not to blame policymakers for dealing with an externality in a very classic way that economists have taught how to deal with it for 150 years.
I didn't blame any policymaker.
Okay, you said you didn't need regulations, but you
I don't need regulations. I'm already doing it.
But you're doing it because you expect the regulations. You just said that.
I take into account the probability that these things may occur.
We should find a different topic.
Listen, Southern Company's doing it. Find another company. Nobody's doing more.
I find this fascinating, I have to say. Much more interesting than my asking questions.
Should we talk about the airlines?
So we've got a little bit less than 10 minutes left. And speaking of other people besides me asking questions, I want to open it up a little bit. And we'll go to a couple different places. And I have one rule for these things, which is all the question askers cannot be men.
We're starting out.
Mr. Fanning, you're on the Atlanta Fed.
Yes, sir.
I've observed firsthand, and now it's hitting the press, that the issuers are starting to send out millions of credit cards again to subprime borrowers. The banks are pushing their home equity loans. God forbid, people build a little equity in this country. What do you think about that?
Listen, thank you for the question, and I think it's a wonderful question because you get this, again, think about this notion of value as a function of risk and return. That's a foundational financial concept. And I know that when you think about the analog for return to the Fed is growth in GDP, right? And so to the extent we can move consumption and GDP growth and everything up, well, that's helpful by that definition. The risk that I think we see is kind of runaway inflation because of an expanding balance sheet. And there's lots of arguments about pro and con. Have we done too much, or are we doing just the right amount, or is there more to go? For this balance of growing the economy relative to the risk we're taking on inflation. But you raise a very interesting question, and that is, what are we going to do about personal consumption and growing personal income kind of wealth? See, Southern Company is the highest rated financial integrity company in our industry. We have the highest bond ratings and everything else. A lot of crazy investment bankers will run around and tell us you got too much equity in your business. What's wrong with the United States public having a little more equity on their balance sheet? See, value is a function of risk and return. Having a little more household buffer to the vagaries of the economy and the job market, in my sense, is a good thing. We shouldn't measure success only by growth. We should measure success by the overall financial integrity of the nation, which includes adding personal savings rates, reducing risk. That's a good thing.
Are you worried that we're getting back into some excess in various forms of lending?
In the housing sector, I'm worried that credit standards are still way too tough and that we're overcorrecting. That if you look at the FICO scores of borrowers today, people that could easily have gotten a loan in 2002 and 2003 can't get one today. And that if you look at the housing market, we're building about 1 million homes a year. We need about 1.6 million a year. And about half of that difference is these overly tight credit standards. The reasons, there's a lot of reasons for those credit standards, but one of them is Fannie and Freddie guarantee mortgages. And if the mortgage goes bad, they'll pay it. Problem is, if you did something wrong in originating that mortgage, they won't honor the guarantee. That's completely reasonable. That's what should happen. But there's been a lot of, one technicality on page 40 of the form, and they won't guarantee it. That makes the bank nervous. They put 2 loan officers on it instead of 1. They don't make the loan they would have otherwise made. So you've seen an overcorrection from the financial crisis in the housing sector. And that's a view that Ben Bernanke used to talk about when he was chair of the Fed. And it's one of the reasons why we need to bring more certainty to our housing market so that we could have a more predictable flow of credit. So it's great for people to build up equity, but people should have access to mortgages if they reasonably can pay them back. And a lot of people who can don't have that access right now.
Got bright lights on me, so I'm trying to see in the back. Anyone in the back have one?
Great, thank you very much. Good discussion. I guess I'd like to come back to Southern again because early on in your remarks, I heard, I think what you said is a 50-year glide path before you substantially had a large component of renewables. And so that sounds long to me, particularly when I think the statistics in Germany are something like a move from about 6% to 25% of their entire consumption in like 12 years. And so could you just talk a little bit more about your 50-year glide path?
I didn't say 50-year glide path, but I'll talk about it a little bit. The reason Germany had this explosion in renewables is that they had something like 45-cent feed-in tariffs, where they subsidized heavily the investment in renewables. And so people made sound economic decisions. They invested in renewables and everything else. EIA's own data would show, that's the Energy Information Administration, would show that the tax preference items accorded renewables in the United States are about, on a per unit basis, per barrel of oil, per therm, or however you want to measure it, something like 100 times what's accorded oil, gas, and coal, and 35 times what's afforded nuclear. Now, having said that, I think those, and in fact, if you want to Google it, you can look at me talk about tax policy on Google and all this other stuff. I am much more in favor of things like Simpson-Bowles or Baucus-Camp, where I think we've got to take down this Byzantine tax code that I think untowardly influences commercial decisions and picks winners and losers. I would let the market reside itself. There is absolutely a right place, and please understand, as we're one of the largest solar players in the United States, I take advantage of those tax preference items. Okay, so I'm not saying, you know, I have my nose in that trough also. I do it also in nuclear. There are reasons why tax preference items are accorded different technologies, and that's really to get them started and get them sustained and everything else. I would argue that sound economic policy would recognize that when certain technologies start to get mature, that you start to withdraw those supports. That's what I would be in favor of. I think the right way for the United States government to play is in the kind of bench research innovation work. There's an S-curve. If I had a chart, I'd show you, but it basically shows the research and development curve of investment, where there's very early bench research, and then there is scale up, and then there is commercialization. The United States Department of Energy does a darn good job fostering bench research. We work with those people. Southern Company fills the void of scale up. We try and break technology to make it sure that when it becomes commercial, it will work. That's where I think it can work. Now, with respect to renewables, I have always been, if you look back 4 years ago when I became chairman of Southern, a big fan of solar. I think wind has its place. It doesn't have a place for my company just because of climatology. We run the nation's largest biomass facility in Texas. There's a lot of things that renewables can do that are good. And you know, when you hear this argument about disruptive distributed generation, I don't believe that's particularly disruptive. If you think about innovation in energy, what is disruptive will be storage. And we're spending a lot of time on that. So look, I think renewables are important. They're exciting. I think different parts of the United States will move at different paces because of climate, sunlight intensity, and a variety of other things. I'm very bullish on renewables.
Last lightning round question for you, because I hear we're almost out of time. How do we fix the airline industry?
Hopeless.
Okay, thank you both. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Should have said next.